My name is Eric Smith, and this is my story of change. Like many of you, I grew up in a small town in the South, and my parents got married when they were 18 years old, and had my brother pretty soon after they were married, and then a year and a half later had me, and within a year after having me, my parents got divorced. And so I don't even really remember my parents being married, but I know that it probably had an impact on me. It obviously had an impact growing up having my parents divorced. And anyway, my mom got remarried about a year and a half later to an incredible guy, my stepdad, David Murrah, who I love to death. And then my dad was remarried not long after that as well. My parents were awesome to me, especially my mom and my stepdad. But my dad had always struggled with alcohol, and that was a big part of his life. And it was just a wild and crazy kind of growing up. But as a child, I had a good upbringing in a small town. I actually, from the time I was about 3 years old until after 7th grade, I lived in a town called Iuka, Mississippi. I-U-K-A. It's an Indian name, a really small place of about 6,000 people, and lived there. And like many who are hearing my story today, maybe grew up in a really small town, you know that drugs can run rampant in those places. Well, my brothers, who were all older than me at the time, began to get involved in a lot of crazy stuff. And I can remember in 5th, 6th grade thinking, man, I can't believe my brothers are doing this stuff. I just don't understand why they would choose to make these decisions. And then I can still remember it was right after I had turned 13. I was in the 7th grade, and one of my best friends, who's no longer alive, we were hanging out, and he started talking to me about getting high. And it was the very first time I ever got high. And from that point on, my life began to spin out of control. I know it's crazy to think about a 13-year-old, that's practically like a child, using drugs, but from that point on, my life would take a downward turn for the next 6 years, where I would become a daily drug user. And it was a crazy thing because about a year after I started using drugs, my mom and my stepdad obviously started to discover what I was doing, and I was living with them and had lived with them my whole life. And I escaped and obviously broke my mom's heart. But I was old enough at the point where I could choose where to live, so I moved in with my dad, who had been recently divorced again, and moved in with him, and it was just me and my dad. And honestly, my dad didn't know how to raise a kid, and I ran completely over him. I could do whatever I wanted. I had no curfew. From the moment I moved into his house in the summer of going into 8th grade, I was wild, and I could do whatever I wanted, and I took advantage of it. From that point on, not only did I use alcohol and smoke marijuana, but the other drugs began to become so prevalent in my life, and even began to take the opportunity to make money distributing drugs and selling them to resource our habit and to do more things. And it was just out of control, to be honest with you. There were so many times where it's amazing that my life wasn't taken. I can think back to situations where I was so close to going to jail, but somehow God protected me and preserved me from having that happen. I mean, the stories I could tell are crazy, and the things that I've seen, and the heartbreak and the brokenness and the just unbelievable disease of addiction that I've seen with my eyes in my family, but also with friends, was unbelievable. But for the next 6 years, all the way through middle school and high school, my life was consumed with drugs. My life was consumed with girls. I didn't care about anybody but myself, and if I could use somebody to get what I wanted, I would do it. And it's kind of funny now today being a pastor, because I was probably the worst user of people that you can imagine. If I could get something from them, to use them to get it, I would do it, whether it was a girl or whether it was something to get drugs. I used people to get what I wanted, which I think people who are caught up in addiction tend to do. I don't know how I excelled in sports, because I used drugs every day for 6 years, all through high school and middle school, and was playing sports along with that, specifically football and baseball. And it got toward my senior year, and I happened to start dating this girl who was a sophomore. And of course, I was dating her just so I could hook up and do all the things that high school boys that don't know Jesus want to do, right? And so what was crazy, though, was her parents said, listen, if you want to see our daughter, you've got to come to church. The first time they said that, I thought, no way, I'm not going to church. I haven't even walked into a church building in over 6 years, much less gone to a church service. But she was pretty cute, so I gave in, and I went to church. And I can still remember as an 18-year-old sitting through those services and hearing about Jesus. And it was the first time in my life that I understood what the guy was saying. I didn't know if I agreed with what he was saying, but I at least understood what he was saying. And it started to make me wrestle with a few things and ask questions. I can remember moments of feeling conviction and just wondering, what does this mean? What am I supposed to do? But I continued to carry on with my life as normal, using drugs, having a good time, partying, abusing and using people. And she and I quit dating, and so of course I quit church immediately. Well, a few months passed, and a friend of mine who's now a professor at Southeastern Seminary, who I went to high school with and played baseball with, we were hitting the baseball, getting ready for baseball season, and he kept nagging me to go to church because he knew that I had gone to church with this girl I had been dating. And I kept telling him to leave me alone, and finally I gave in to his request. I said, fine, man, I'll go to church with you. And so Benjamin convinced me to go to church. And for 3 weeks straight, at the beginning of 2000, I went to church. And I can still remember January 23rd of 2000 so clearly. I went to church that morning, and I left, and I just felt weird. I had heard the good news of Jesus for 3 weeks straight, and I decided to go back to church that night on Sunday night. And I walked into the room, and for me, it just felt heavy. I don't know why. I'd always been the type of guy that thought if I walk into a church, I may catch on fire and the church may explode. You know, I'm such an evil, awful person. And I go to church that night, and I can still remember the pastor, Dr. Randy Bostick at Oakland Baptist Church in Corinth, Mississippi, where I was living. And he was preaching the gospel, and he was sharing the good news of Jesus. And he shared this story that he remembered where he was at a revival. It was like this tent revival, this old school revival with his dad. And this preacher had a lantern with a red light in it. And he was up there preaching and sharing what would happen if you died and you didn't have Jesus in your life. Well, I can remember sitting in the back of that room in that seat, and it felt like I was chained down to the chair. I wanted to move. I wanted to respond to God, but I just couldn't. I got in my truck. I started to drive home that night. And halfway home, it was like God's Spirit invaded my truck. I broke down in tears, and I wasn't the type of guy who cried, okay? Crying was for weenies in my book, and I wasn't a guy who cried, but I was breaking down, crying, and I turned around and I drove back to the church. I pulled up and I went in there to find Benjamin, my friend who had invited me, and I found his dad, and his dad said, Benjamin's already gone home. You can go to our house. So I jumped in my truck and I drove as fast as I could to Benjamin's house. And I sat there for 2 hours, and I explained to him what God was doing in my heart and in my life. And it was during that process, after about 2 hours of questioning and wrestling and thinking, I don't know if I can give up my life. I just don't know if God will accept me. I don't know if I can change. I don't know if I can, if I can make these kind of changes that it takes to be a Christian, because I had seen so many fake Christians that I didn't want to be another one of those people. If I was going to follow Jesus, it was going to be for real. And I hit the floor that night on my face in his room. And I called out to God at like 10 o'clock that night. And I can still remember the weight of my sin being taken off my back. I can still remember the freedom I felt in that moment that God changed my life. A kid who had used drugs for 6 years. And that night, January 23rd, 2000, my relationship with Jesus began. My story changed. And it was on that night that I would forever be changed. From that moment on, I never used drugs again. I had gone from a life of dependency on drugs, of girls, of all the things that this world had to offer, money from selling, all kinds of stuff, to a person who had been set free by Jesus. And that may be what you need in your life. Man, God can change you. It doesn't matter how wretched you think you are. It doesn't matter how far you think you are from God. God can change you. And here's the really cool thing, is God will give you the power to change the direction of your life. I didn't have the strength to quit using. I didn't have the strength to change my outward behaviors, but God came in inwardly and transformed my heart. He changed the way I feel about people. I mean, now I spend every day caring about people, where before I used every day to use people. Now I spend my life trying to help people break free from addiction and sin, where before I was bound by addiction and sin. God can do it. He did it in my life, and He can do it in your life. You know what's so crazy? Is 20 years ago when this church was started, I bet you they never thought that their pastor today would be a guy who at that same time was using drugs 20 years ago. But that's the power of our God. He can change your story. It's all about surrender. It's surrendering everything you have and everything you are to the person and work of Jesus Christ. It's not based on your perfect life. It's based on His perfect life. And my story was forever changed because I surrendered to Jesus. Not because I did anything, but because Christ had done everything for me. And I simply received that gift. Man, I hope that you will wrestle with your life. Truly ask yourself if you know Jesus. Not just some religious garbage, but put your faith and trust in Him, and your life will be forever changed. I'm Eric Smith, and that's my story of change.